evening and welcome to Product Tank. My name is Ada. I'm the curator for this evening's event. And the agenda for tonight is a quick introduction from me, followed by our sponsors. And then we're going to go straight to our talks. And then wrapping up with a survey and a Q&A. Now, I know many of you haven't been in a Product Tank meetup before. It all started many years ago with about 20 odd people in a London pub somewhere, wanting to share ideas about product over a few beers. We've now grown to over 150,000 members across 200 cities worldwide. In London, our Product Tank tends to meet every month, and these are the dates on the screen. If you want to make a note of it, please do. We're not sure right now whether the May Product Tank is going to be virtual or online or in person. So it's going to be probably a matter of checking the website nearer the time. Product Tank is part of Mind the Product, the largest product community in the world. Not only do they do conferences, they also have a regular newsletter, a blog, and a Slack channel that reaches out to many product managers globally. And they are our sponsor this evening. So I'm going to pass you over to Martin, co-founder, who's going to say a few words.
Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on a Product Tank stage, even if it's a virtual one. In fact, next month is going to be 10 years since I started that first Product Tank right here in London, and we'll be celebrating that at World Product Day on May 27th. And we've spent those past 10 years with one simple mission: to make product people more successful. As I said, we've grown from that first meetup with just 25 people here in London to over 200,000 attendees across 200 cities, as well as sharing hundreds of videos and thousands of articles on our site. And we've been able to support that growth and provide all of this great content for free because of the support of the community, our Product Tank organizers, but crucially also thanks to the resources and the team that's paid for by our conferences and events. As you can probably imagine, with 1.5 billion people under lockdown right now, events is a very difficult business to be in. The beauty of our chosen mission, however, is that it's centered on you, on our community, and on making you more successful, but not on how we actually do that. So as good product managers, we've gone back to the drawing board on how best to help us all improve our craft. And we're excited to announce that we're about to launch a new digital membership program. Now, this idea has been in the works for some time, but it's amazing what a pandemic can do to shake up your priorities. Almost all of the usual content that you know and love will still be free. Product Tank will still be free, but as a paying member, you will also get premium deep dive editorial like case studies, industry reports, and more, direct access to product experts through regular AMAs, and the chance to connect directly with peers that are tackling similar challenges. We're starting here based on our product discovery and feedback from all of you, and we'll continue to evolve the program based on that feedback. Our goal is that Mind the Product membership will ensure that we can continue to invest in this community and actually invest even more in content and connections to help move our craft forward. And we were hoping to have that membership program live for today so that you could all go and check it out and learn more. But you all know what happens when you have an externally forced deadline. We hit some snags and it's not going to be ready till next week. So we'll be going live next week. Keep an eye out on our website and in your inboxes for more information. And I really do hope you will all join us as Mind the Product members so that we can continue to make you more successful product people long into the future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Martin. I definitely will look forward to that next week. There's a lot of you out there on YouTube tonight, and I just want to make sure you guys know how to ask questions for any of our speakers. You've got to log on to YouTube and then click on Show Chat before you can post a question on the right-hand side. So that again is log on to YouTube, do Show Chat, and then put your question there. We're going to do Q&A right at the end, so please do save them for later, but please do put them as we go along. This is our second virtual meetup. We've not done one before using this current broadcasting studio. We would love your feedback so that we can improve it for the future. I've got a short survey with the URL there, which I'll also post into the YouTube comments. At the end of the 3 talks, we'll be really grateful if you can help us fill in the questionnaire. Tonight's theme is about how do we grow product from a startup to a scale-up to an enterprise. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to Adriana, Chief Product Officer at Climate 8 Invest. Now, when I was starting out to look for speakers for this meetup, I was really impressed with her range of experience in startups and scale-ups in the travel industry, in commerce, and also in fintech. Her talk tonight is about dispelling the myths that we hear quite often around product managers. Over to you, Adriana.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Ada, for having me, and thanks to ProductTank as well in this amazing audience. So I'll be going through what has been my experience doing product startups and scale-ups, and as well, what are the myths that are out there, and how have they turned up in reality for me. Just a little bit about my experience. I started my career in the airline industry, and I was an internal consultant. Very quickly, I realized that it was not as executional as I wanted it to. Oh, seem to have audio issues. I don't know, guys, if I can do something to fix it. If needed, I can also turn on my camera. I'll try that. As I was saying, I was feeling that I was lacking it was too strategic for me to do more of the execution. And as I was thinking about my MBA, which I was fortunate enough to do at Stanford, I was thinking about the next step and what I wanted to do, and that's how I landed between my first and second year at a product management internship at Expedia, which was a great blend of my former experience in the airline business and the travel industry, and now with the new product management experience at Expedia. However, I graduated in 2009, which at that point seemed like a very big crisis. Now, in retrospective, I think it was a little bit mild compared to what we're going through right now. But in any case, I think it enabled me to think more creatively about what kind of companies I wanted to join, and that's where I started my startup journey. I joined a company called Tiny Prints, which was eventually acquired by Butterfly in the US. Then I joined a company called Trulia. Some of you may know it. It was one of the key competitors in the real estate tech, consumer tech in the US. I was based in San Francisco, and then I was through the IPO with them. That was an amazing experience, and it's yeah, it was like a dream come true. And then I moved to Europe. I started working for UDO, which was a little bit of a bigger company. But then moving to London, I went back to the startup scale world, joining Nutmeg, then Pollen, which is in the event space, and now more recently joining as a CPO at Climate Invest in a very early stage. So I have been a combination of Series C, Series A, Series B, and I think that is what I would like to share with you right now. Let me pause for a second because it seems that we're not having good sound. One second, let me try to. All right, let's give it a try right now. Oops. Is that better, team? Okay, awesome. All right, so let's continue then. So yeah, the objectives are today to talk you through real examples. We read a lot in the books, we read a lot of the articles, and we start having an idea of what are the product myths and best practices, when in reality, it's not always the case, and that doesn't mean that you're not doing a good job. So let's start with the first myth, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard, and a lot of authors have started dispelling, in the most recent years. But it sounds so glamorous, right? Like you're the CEO of the product. It sounds like you're the boss. Everyone should be hearing you. And the reality is that when you are working for a startup, you're not the CEO of the product. There's already a CEO who has founded the company and who thinks of it as their baby. And that's the reality of it. You may have different flavors of a CEO. You may have a CEO that is very good doing product. And I think at that point is finding how are you going to complement their skills. If you have a very strong product CEO, then you can fill in the gap a lot on the execution side, because the founder is not necessarily going to be thinking about product the whole time, and that's where your strength can be. Now, it's important for you going into a startup to be fully aware of what kind of CEO you're going to face, because it takes some time to find each other's space, and it also is like a dance. You need to find the chemistry with your CEO in order not to step on each other's toes. And then you can also have a non-product CEO, probably someone super technical, or probably someone that is mostly focusing on the commercial side of things. And that's where you can provide your product leadership. So my best advice for you is to really dig deeper into how it is to work with your CEO, because if your product person number one is going to be it's going to be a very critical role, as always product management is, but you really need to find your space to make that a productive relationship. For now, I joined as a CPO at Climate Invest. My CEO, he's a visionary. He knows a lot of what we want to accomplish, but he doesn't have the time. We're in the middle of crowdfunding right now, and he's fully focusing on raising funds for our company, which is, of course, critical for our survival. So I can fill in the gap a lot in the product leadership space. But I think my advice to you is just to find your chemistry with the CEO, as I said. And sometimes it's going to work, and sometimes it's not really going to work. And it's okay to be frustrated, and it's okay to look for the next thing. In the case of scaleups, you still may be the CEO of your product in case the scale-up has gotten to a significant scale. But the founder can be still highly involved in the product decisions. And that's still right, because the founder is also going to have a lot of the soul of the company. Now you need to learn how to navigate, right? Like, I think what's important here is to, again, earn the trust of the CEO. And since that person can and want to still be involved in the product decisions, then bring them in and try to download as much of their vision as possible within the ideation meetings, so that they can feel that they have made the right level of contribution. As always, I think it's important for you as a product manager to be the customer expert. That's usually the gap that the CEO is not going to be able to fill in, because he's not going to have the time to talk to customers, to go through the analytics, to really understand what to build and what's the right prioritization of things to build. So the second myth is your product decision should always be customer-centric. I found this cartoon and I found it really interesting because there's so many buzzwords out there, and customer-centric is one that I think I have used and probably abused. And it's not always the case. It's not always the case that you can be customer-centric all the time. And why is that? I think as I enter my fintech journey, when I joined Nutmeg, I found a new stakeholder, a new partner that I didn't think it was going to be that critical, and it ended up being, I guess, crucial in most of the things that I launched. The compliance team, compliance manager, there could be someone that is in the legal department, and that person is going to be your counterpart. So in any case, the regulatory framework may prevent you from being always customer-centric. And what do you need to do then? I think initially at Nutmeg, I was resisting it. I was saying, no, this person doesn't know anything. That person is against innovation. The reality is that you need to embrace it because this person in the end is looking at the same problem. That person also wants to serve customers, also wants to help them as much as possible to achieve their goals. You're looking at it from different lenses, but in the end, you have a lot of common ground. It's a tension that you're meant to have in not just in fintech, but also in a lot of regulated industries. So embrace it, go for drinks with this person or go for coffee with this person, because that's a long-term relationship. And the more empathetic you are as well, and the more knowledgeable you are on the compliance side, the more you can take those inputs into account when you're thinking about building your solutions for a customer. What happens at scale-ups? I think that the scale-up problem, not just in fintech, but in general, I think it's slightly different. When scale-ups are growing, are in hyper-growth mode, there's so many product teams, and you start realizing, oh, okay, so I should be doing this based on the qualitative and quantitative feedback that I have. Great. But then you start seeing that your dependencies on the other teams mean that it will take twice the amount of time or more, or even make it impossible for you to be nailing that customer need. So I think at that point is the role of the product leader, but also of the product manager, to start opening up the channels of communication. I think you can start seeing that there's going to be more, you're going to need to rely more on the operational folks, on the customer service folks, also on the marketing teams as well, which may have other problems, other competing goals. So what's important here is to really do cross-functional teams and not to think about the product team as just engineering, product, and design, but also to think about the other functions that are really going to help you reach your goals. You also need to share. You need to share your insights, your resources, but also share your challenges, because there might be other product teams that might be sharing the same challenges and you can work on them together. And also important to share your timelines, because it might be that you can negotiate for another team to even accelerate something that they're working on, that it's a dependency on you. But if you keep working on silos, that's where the problems start at scale-ups, because it is not always apparent that you're going to have a dependency because you're in hyper-growth mode. So be mindful of that and open up the channels of communication. And the last myth that I want to refer to is you always need to be product-centric. That's another buzzword. Build a great product and everything else will follow. I found this cartoon to be a good reflection of my my usage of remote controls, which I barely know how to use nowadays. But yeah, like the more features you put into a product, the better a product is going to be. And I think I wanted to just share this interesting graph of the startup. And of course, it's not always like that, but it's a good display of how much enthusiasm you have, and then you launch and you have to start iterating and pivoting, and you have to start again. And then at some point, you reach product market fit, which sounds like the holy grail and like the ideal that everyone in the startup world is looking for. So it's important to think it's not just about the product, because at that point, no one knows about you. The customers haven't even heard about you. So it's important, of course, to find an audience, an underserved customer segments, and then to work on something for their needs. But it's also important to look at the right acquisition channels, and that's something that you're going to learn together with your marketing team or your marketing person, because it's not always that you're going to have a team. And And also sometimes I found myself that I sometimes need to tweak my product in order to fit the right acquisition channel. So it's just important for you to think that at the startup stage, you need to always consider product market fit first. And there's a side of product, but there's also a side of market. There's a side of demand that is as critical as building the right product. All right, just doing a little bit of time check. And then in the scale-up world, the challenge is a little bit different as well, because this is where operations is your critical stakeholder. If you're building something and it can be the right feature for the customer, does it really work from an operational standpoint? Because if you cannot properly serve your customer, then are you really launching what you should be launching for your customer? At that point, again, I remember this while I was at Nutmeg, we were going to launch one new product, the Lifetime ISA, which some of you may know what that is. And a lot of pushback from the beginning when we were starting to think about, should we build this or should we not, was coming from the operational side. Because this product was unique enough that was not necessarily going to fit the operational processes that we already had in place. So at that point, I really worked very closely together with the operational team in the form of a task force. They were part of back to building really a cross-functional team. They were part of the team building the Lifetime ISA. And there were things that we needed to cut corners on. I think we made them part of the ideation and the product definition, but at some point we needed to negotiate the things like, okay, so we're going to have to embrace this new manual, crazy process. But I promise to you, I commit to you that even if it doesn't make it for the first launch, we're going to have another launch in which we try to alleviate your pain points. So because in general, I think that we leave that behind, the operational side, and then usually there's the operations team that, they look like swans and they're navigating and doing the work, but behind the scenes, they're doing a lot of work. And the most you can do to help them serve the product, the best you're doing for your customers in the end. And then there's a point in which you probably need to start thinking about introducing the product operations manager. The product operations manager can help you navigate and facilitate. And sometimes the product manager is in charge of building the product, and the product operations manager is in charge of really serving the product. So there's a scale in which these two roles can exist. Key takeaways then, I think now more than ever, it's about adjusting all of your learnings to your context. Product management, the way that I have seen is an art, is not a science. So you always need to keep curious and keep on learning. And by adjusting, I don't mean that you have to, conform to standards or conform to your reality. In fact, I think that's completely opposite to how we operate as product managers, because we want to change the world. And you can always aim for excellence and best practices, but you always need to be mindful. Does this specific insight apply in my case? Can I stretch it so that it applies? But if not, adjust to my environment, continue pushing for the change, because we may not be at the right stage to apply this specific methodology or concept. Hope this has been helpful. This is where I am, and I'm looking forward to what the other speakers have to tell us about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I really like that startup curve, and I'm also one of those people that can't really use my latest remote control. So thank you very much again. I can see that there's not been many questions on YouTube channel so far. So if you've got any questions for Adriana, please do comment on the right-hand side so that we can cover them during Q&A. Our second speaker tonight is James Adams, Head of People and Talent at Commonplace. Now, I first met James at an interview, and he wowed me with all the stories and insight he has understanding the people and the talent and the culture of startups. He was the head of people at justgiving.com for many years, and he's now a consultant for Seeds, Series A and Series B. Over to you, James.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Ada, for inviting me and curating this evening's lineup. Thank you, Alina and the Product Tank team for having me, and Martin at the team for Mind the Product for sponsoring. For the purposes of this evening's talk, people decisions can broadly be categorized into the 4 pillars of HR that will govern your entire employee experience, regardless of where you work. And those 4 pillars are employee engagement, learning and development, reward and recognition, and performance management. I know what you're thinking. How did I get on here? Well, I was a recruiter for 9 years, as Ada said. Then I was head of people, then a consultant. My job is to help people realize successful outcomes in product-led companies. I've worked from bootstrap startups through Series A to Series C scale-ups, and even NASDAQ-listed corporates, as you can see on this slide. And I've supported product for companies in B2B and B2C software, virtual reality technology, and also medical and defense hardware, from junior associate product right up to chief product officer. Someone's just told me you can't see my slides, so that's fun. Bear with me just a second. Okay, that's me. And I'm hoping you can now see my slides. Perfect. Okay, apologies for that. Hopefully that's going to be the only small issue that happens throughout the talk. So I'll start with an interesting statistic. Upwards of 35% of failed startups and scale-ups cite not having the right person in the right role as their primary reason for failure. Anecdotally, for me, that's product more often than not. And it also applies to new ventures in enterprise businesses. I'd like to help unpick what that means and how to try to avoid that pitfall when it comes to people decision-making around product. Hopefully, by having a non-product person giving you their perspective on product from the outside looking in, it may also help to challenge how you approach product at your company. There are 4 areas I'm going to focus on: having an outcomes-driven approach, competencies, challenges in startups, scale-ups, and enterprise, and also tips on working with recruiters. Now, I start at the end, which is success. I have a rule with my clients that a role doesn't exist if you can't tell me what it should deliver for the next 3 to 6 months in a startup, 6 to 12 months in a scale-up, and 12 months and beyond in an enterprise. And the reason that timeline increases is because typically the bigger the company, the longer it takes to affect change and therefore to measure impact. With each role, we ask, how can you deliver effectively when you don't know what you're trying to deliver? But also, how do you keep product people engaged when they don't know why their work matters? If we refer back to those 4 pillars of HR, this is linked to the employee engagement pillar. So for us at Commonplace, this is how we display what success looks like for any role. We have clearly stated objectives that set the VP product and tech up for success. And my big suggestion for all of you is, if something like this doesn't exist for your role, ask for it. Now, competencies is a complicated area, but it's an area that I'm hoping we can get some clarity on over the next few slides. But before we get into that, this search took me about 2 minutes, and it shows 16 different potential job titles for product managers, depending on which Medium article, LinkedIn post, or blog you read. Now, although this slide demonstrates what kind of product specialism you can move into to grow a product, typically as you get into scale up and even enterprise, you should beware. The terminology on this slide is confusing and exclusive, and it alienates non-product people. Whether in a startup, a scale up, or an enterprise, a key responsibility for a product person is to lead others through trust and by inspiring confidence. Whether you're seeking sign-off from procurement in an enterprise or working one-on-one with a founder in an early-stage startup, baffling non-product people with sector-specific lingo is counterproductive. This is why we focus on competencies in support of success objectives, the first of which is knowledge. Now, knowledge, broadly, something you can learn. It's not what you do or how you do it. Knowledge is subject matter expertise. It's accreditations. And if we think about the 4 pillars of HR, knowledge links to learning and development. Now, it's most important to have subject matter expertise when you're working with bigger budgets in bigger teams where there's more specialization and more bespoke products. So it matters most in an enterprise. For example, in the defense industry, if you're building a joystick to go in the Eurofighter jet, it is imperative that you have the subject matter expertise around weapons control systems. But on the scale up and startup side, let's say that your industry sector is edtech. Now the product might be a language learning app. You don't need a teaching qualification to work in edtech. What you need to know is how to build a product, more importantly. There are exceptions. So highly regulated industries like finance may require some subject expertise at a startup stage, but more often than not, it's knowledge is most applicable in the world of enterprise. Now, the next competency I'd like to talk about is skills or experience. Please don't waste time reading the list of skills that are mentioned on this slide. This is how not to do it. Skills, also called experience, are things that you do and have done, and they tie to the performance management pillar of HR. Now, these are important whether you're thinking about startup, scale up, or enterprise. In a startup, we're typically looking for a breadth of skills. So it may be having some product management experience, but also knowing how to code a little bit and being comfortable public speaking to advocate a product at trade shows. In a scale up, you may find that the skills required are a little more specific to a challenge. So you may be asked if you've introduced metrics to track optimization and retention on a B2C product. But in enterprise, we're typically looking at very specific skills. So have you led a team building an e-com payment solution for launch in a new global region? And it's really important across all of those different company sizes that we think about how relevant a skill is. Now, a tip for you if you're hiring, try to focus on no more than 5 to 8 core skills that are actually necessary in order for a role holder to achieve success. Be specific. There's nothing worse than a job spec that states you should have some of these skills. And please only test people if you have the expertise in-house to review it. Make sure any testing is relevant to a role, and please keep it brief. Now, before we move into the third set of competencies, I'd like to offer a warning on culture. Because the truth about culture is this: many cultural manifestos are broadly meaningless. Their list of aspirations, nothing more. How you respond in times of crisis, like during this pandemic, will really tell you a lot about this culture. And I think there's quite a few companies who have been through a lot of soul searching about who they really are over the last few weeks. Now, an easy way to stress test a cultural manifesto, so the sort of values that you see that companies aspire to or share on their website, simply take each word that you see and think of the opposite. So if a company say, we're honest, well, as opposed to what? You lie? If a company say, we're purposeful, well, as opposed to what? You're money hungry? Culture, values, broadly, they're very hard to understand, they're very hard to define, and they're even harder to prove that you have. So instead, for every role, we should think about behaviors. Now, behaviors are typically linked to reward and recognition because it's not just about what you do, but it's about how you go about it. And it's about having tangible, testable ways that people act, and values then being a measure of those. So to give you an idea of a good way of thinking about a behavior, your cultural value may be transparency, as opposed to what? Being secretive. Well, the skill then could be giving and taking constructive 360 feedback to your peers each week. But remember, you can be transparent and still be unpleasant. What we're really thinking about is the outcome of your output. So the behavior then is either accepting honest, constructive feedback in the spirit in which it is intended, or giving feedback in a way that best suits your recipient. That's a good way of thinking about behaviors. A bad way of thinking about behaviors? Well, I worked with a company recently who had this word on their role profile. I've been practicing this all week. I'm probably still going to get it wrong. Brobdingnagian. Yes, there we go. You heard it the first time, it's fine. What it means is colossal thinking. But if you have to have read Gulliver's Travels to be able to understand what the values are at a certain company, then it's pretty clear that there is a flaw in the thinking behind putting that on the role profile. So moving forward, make sure that what you're looking for is clear, it's not unquantifiable, and that it's easy for people to understand. Now, the next thing I want to touch on is some of the challenges that you might encounter trying to get people decisions made in a startup, a scale-up, or enterprise. So in terms of hiring for an enterprise, massive challenge that I see happen all the time is losing out on opportunity because of the length of time of decision making. It may be the case that you've got too many stakeholders in the mix, that priorities are changing, that you just have a huge amount of sign-off in order to get things done. I worked with a chief product officer who was frozen into inaction because he was convinced he'd be judged on the performance of his hires. The result was that we went 12 months with no new product managers within the business. But the impact was that we lost developers because they had no direction and they had no confidence in the way the company was being managed. So there was lost productivity, which resulted in overspend on contractors and missing our goals. And the outcome? Ultimately, that chief product officer was dismissed from his role. So what would I suggest? I think bear in mind that more is lost through indecision than wrong decision. When we think about a scale-up, it's a slightly different set of challenges. When you reach the hallowed ground of scale-up, what it typically means is someone's given you some money. And the tendency always is to rush into things and to try to cut corners. I was supporting a Series B startup a couple of years ago who'd done a 12 million Series B. They came to me and said they wanted to hire a bunch of product managers. I asked them what they wanted the product people to deliver. I said, what's the outcome? What are we looking for? They said, we don't know. But once they arrive, they'll tell us what they need to build and tell us what problem they're here to solve. Now, that's an upside down way of thinking about how to get the best out of people. I suggested we probably shouldn't do it that way. They moved ahead via an alternate source, brought on a bunch of people and then made them all redundant within about 9 months. They didn't think about success in the role. They didn't think about what skills were essential, and they didn't think about what behaviors people really needed to be successful in their team. Now, this is a really weird picture, but this is the biggest challenge that you're likely to encounter when you're working with a startup: hiring voodoo. Hiring voodoo really means bias. And the people that are typically most guilty of this are the CEO or the founders of startups. Why? Well, there's two things to be mindful of. They typically lack the understanding of the product function, unless they're product specialists, which is rare. It'll be even rarer they were hiring a product specialist to come in and support them. They might have very limited hiring experience. And if they have very limited hiring experience and don't understand the function, they will resort to gut feeling, which is based on what? Who looks, thinks, and acts like us. Educational bias is one terrible culprit, and some of the least effective people I've ever worked with, not specifically products, but across the board, carry a first from Oxbridge. It does not prove anything about your work ethic, your creativity, your ability to deliver things. But if I think about other types of bias, I was supporting a bootstrapped startup a few years ago. The CEO said he wanted all of his people to be travelers. When I said, what do you mean by travelers? He said they should have backpacked. They should have taken some time out either after college or after university and backpacked for a year. I said, why? He said, because it shows curiosity. No, it doesn't. It shows privilege. The only thing you can learn about someone who has traveled around the world for a year after their degree without meeting them is that they had the opportunity to travel. It shows you nothing about their ability to think, about how they're going to behave, about what sort of skills they've got. It's really important that when you're hiring for a startup, you focus on behaviors. Startups change. They're frustrating because they're subject to change. Therefore, a product manager needs to respond to change positively with a smile on their face and an appetite to bring others along with them. If any of you have ever worked in teams with a negative product lead, it just kills all kind of creativity and all activity. While we're on the subject of hiring, I'd just like to touch on the different stakeholders that you might meet either internally when you're a hiring manager or externally if you're a candidate trying to get a product role in either a startup, a scale-up, or an enterprise. In a startup, it's typically the founder. So they're going from 0 to 1. It's their product, it's their baby, and they want somebody who can ideate and prototype and build a minimum viable product. A huge amount of that interview process will be based on whether or not they believe you have the behaviors to take something from 0 to 1. But it's different when you're going into a scale up. In a scale up, you might be meeting with a pre-existing exec team. You might be meeting an internal recruiter who's a generalist. You might meet an on-site recruiter, so somebody like a Talentful or an Element who are tasked with hiring the best, but keeping costs low. And at VP or C level, you may even meet a search and select headhunter. Now, that's very different to enterprise. When you're going into an enterprise business, there's typically a big internal recruitment team, or maybe even an on-site recruitment team from a recruitment process outsourcer like James Cahn's Alexander Mann Solutions are a typically well-known business. And it's important that you're thinking about how much that person knows about your knowledge, your skills and behaviors, and then presenting it in a way that hopefully makes it easy for them to consume. Ultimately, these are the people you want working for you. Now, there is one more type of person that you might meet on your journey into any of these types of businesses, and that is the agency recruiter. Now, at some stage throughout your employee experience, all of you will deal with agency recruiters, either as a candidate or a hiring manager. I was one for 9 years, and done properly, like, for example, Nick and Miles at Few and Far, who I know are sponsors of ProductTank. A decent recruiter is worth their weight in gold. Hopefully, I'm about to give you a foolproof system for when you're dealing with agency recruiters, so you can work out whether they're working for you or not. But before I do, I'd like to tell you a quick joke that's occasionally circulated amongst chief people officers and HR directors, which is this. What's the difference between an agency recruiter and a puppy? You mustn't kick a puppy. Now, if you laughed at that, this puppy judges you. So let's talk about the different type of agency recruiter relationships. The first is what we call the swipe right recruiter. Kind of like a Tinder or online dating profile experience. From a candidate perspective, you might get a generic email asking you for a CV update, maybe an ill-researched LinkedIn connection request. I'm sure you've all had those. It's typically spam. From a client perspective, again, it may be some poor email marketing. It's a numbers game. On both sides of this relationship, it may turn into something, but it's a numbers game. So you have to swipe enough to win. Therefore, you should set your expectation. If you get a poorly worded email or an irrelevant CV through the post, you should set your expectation about what level of service you can expect from a swipe right recruiter. The next is the first date recruiter. So from a candidate perspective, you've probably spoken a few times in the past. Maybe they've represented you for a few roles. They might not have placed you, but you'll return their call or respond to the email when they reach out. You know each other's names at least. From a client perspective, they've probably sent you some CVs. Maybe you've had some interviews. You've probably got terms agreed. It's not quite the scattergun approach, but you are still not necessarily where they, the recruiter, make their money. Set your expectations around the service you can expect as a candidate or a client. Now, the third type of agency relationship, this is where we start to get into the relationship that really will have some benefits for you. If you're a candidate, the agent has probably got you a job or a contract. If you're a client, they may have placed someone with you. They have good CV to interview ratios. You can trust them to give you a good referral. If you've got a good working relationship, a friends with benefits relationship with a recruiter, what it means is they have made money from you, or at least someone you've introduced them to. There's nothing wrong with that. That's their job. But you've probably socialized with them once at a celebratory lunch or a thank you dinner. The important thing is there is an understanding that there is value for both parties in the relationship. The relationship works both ways. You're both getting something from it. The last type of relationship I'd like to talk about is the significant other. So from a candidate perspective, perhaps they've placed you multiple times. They would come to you for industry information. They would come to you for a reference or to get an introduction to someone. They'd invite you to events. From a client perspective, they've probably done multiple placements with you. Maybe you do joint branded marketing. They might be an exclusive supplier, or you've even hosted an event together. You guys are going to mate for life. And congratulations. If you get a recruiter like this, this is the holy grail. Hopefully that helps you to understand a little bit about how some of the decision making is made on the other side of the fence about where suppliers invest their time. So in conclusion, 3 things that I'd like you to take away from this. Firstly, make sure you define the outcomes that a role will need in order to grow your products. Think about the importance of different competencies that change from startup to scale up to enterprise. So in a startup, it's mostly about behaviors and your skills. Your behavior is of paramount importance, but in a scale up, it'll be about your skills mostly with your behaviors, because it's what you do as well as how you do it. But in an enterprise, what you know is likely to be a massive part of how you can get by in a role, also with a view on your skills. And then thirdly, the last thing I'd like to think about is the service you receive from a recruitment consultant will be directly tied to how likely they are to make money from you. That's my talk. Thank you all so much for having me, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Great. Thank you, James. That was really insightful. I loved the Tinder analogy as well. It's quite rare for us to have somebody who knows so much about recruitment and talent on product. So if you want to post any questions for James or Adriana, please do enter your question at the comments box. Our last speaker for tonight is Sean O'Neill, Chief Product Officer at GfK. Now, when I was hunting for speakers for this event, what really struck me was that Sean had his product principles on his LinkedIn profile, which really resonate with me. He spent a number of years in startups and also all the way through to enterprise, working for companies like Amazon and Tesco, building products that customers love. So over to you, Sean.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Hopefully the audio and the video is working and everyone can see my screen. But I'm really happy to be here. And if this were a normal product tank, we'd probably have a beer or wine in hand. So for those on the call, we could make a game out of it. And every time I say the word user, customer, or client, take a drink. We'll see how the presentation goes here. So I'm here to talk about the riskiest hypotheses and how to prepare for disruption. So we're going to go through a couple lessons of what other companies have been doing and see what we might learn from it. So first, let me flip to there. I want to give you just a little bit of an overview of my background. I've been fortunate to work with some really interesting, amazing companies and work with some very, very talented people. And I've learned a lot over the years. And I suppose they say experience is when you did not get what you expected. Well, I've got a lot of experience then. I started at Amazon in 1999 and very early days. So lots of valuable lessons there. Last 5 years, I was with Tesco, rebuilding all of the product management discipline, changing all of the online systems, consolidating worldwide e-commerce sites. Really worked with some amazing people there. And through all of this current COVID lockdown, I'm really impressed at the ability for Tesco and the online shopping to really deliver for customers. Currently, I am the Chief Product Officer for GfK, Growth from Knowledge. So we're a big data and analytics company, been around for 85 years, and we get data from about 140,000 retailers around the world, and we make sense of the markets of what's happening across 60 countries. So we have about 1 trillion euro of transactions a year that we see through our systems, and we help make sense of markets, market share, what competitors are doing, so that businesses can make better decisions. So the beginning of what I'd like to talk about first is an important concept that really came from IDEO, a legendary design firm. And our jobs as product managers, there's really 3 elements to it. First, we need to figure out what's desirable for customers in a market. What do they need? What's valuable? Is it usable? Then we need to figure out what's feasible. Can we serve those needs for that product market fit with a specific specification of technology, operations, scale, quality, coverage, service levels? All of that's about feasibility, uncertainty, and risk. And then, is it viable? So if we can serve those needs for that market with this method of tech and ops, at the end of the day, will we have a business we're happy to have? And most of the value is in the middle. The challenge is most businesses, these are at least 3 separate functional orgs that work on them over different periods of time. And that makes it very hard to solve. But our jobs as product managers and product leaders is to iterate to find that center. I want to call out a couple examples of companies that tried but got it wrong. So one example is Cisco, where in the about 10 or 15 years ago came out with the Cisco UMI consumer telepresence. So Cisco is very experienced in video conferencing, has lots of business-to-business capabilities there. So they're very strong in the feasibility and the tech. Customers definitely like the idea of video conferencing with family and friends, so it's highly desired. But the problem was it failed the viability. They were charging $599 for this unit, plus a $25 a month monthly fee. At the same time, Skype was free. So they weren't really thinking about what were the other alternatives for that job to be done. Plus, if you want to talk to grandma, she's got to buy a unit. And you want to talk to Aunt Betty, she's got to buy a unit. So the whole thing failed. A second example is Microsoft Bob. So this is going back a bit for those who remember some of the early Microsoft operating systems. Bob was one of the first attempts to have a completely visual operating system, including the ability for a user to not have to know how computers work. So they really had a strong design metaphor about your computer being a home, and you have things in the garage, you have things in the office, and they tried to do it in a visual way. So customers definitely wanted a simpler operating system. It was definitely viable because they knew they could scale it and price it and sell it, but it failed the feasibility test. The computers at that time just did not have enough horsepower. The chips weren't fast enough, the RAM wasn't big enough, the storage wasn't enough, and it just failed. Nobody wanted it. The last one is probably the most amusing. Gerber Singles. So Gerber is a famous baby food company in the US. And back in the 70s, Gerber had the idea of coming out with baby food for adults. So it's hard to chew, and you're a busy adult on the go. So how about Gerber Singles? They certainly had the feasibility of how to mass produce baby food or non-chewable food at scale. They had distribution, so it definitely was feasible, and it was definitely viable. They had the retail distribution. They had the ability to price it at volume, and so it would have worked, but it failed desirability. It turns out that's not what young adults want. So it's useful to think about desirable, feasible, and viable. So now with that as a backdrop, where you're thinking, what is the type of risk? Let's go to the riskiest hypotheses. I want to use Tesla as an example here. So our goal at Tesla in their vision is to accelerate the advent of sustainable transport by bringing compelling mass market electric cars to market as soon as possible. So that's their vision. But let's take a look at how they've evolved their product line and see how that matches up. So in 2008, the first product they came out with was the Roadster, with a price tag at the time of $98,000. Okay, interesting. Doesn't sound like a mass market car. Then in 2012, the Model S, $57,000, lower than the Roadster, but still not quite a mass market price point. Then the 2015 Model X, $80,000. Whoa, hey, that's going the other direction. That's not mass market. And then they get to the Model 3, starting at a price point that's much closer to a mass market model. So why did they do this evolution? So let's think about, at the start, what was Tesla's riskiest hypothesis? So if you think about the Tesla Roadster, I want to show you another car and see if you can see some similarities here. It's very similar because this is the Lotus Elise. And it turns out Tesla had a risky assumption, but their risky assumption was not, can we build a car frame and a chassis and 4 wheels that are round that roll? Nobody doubted they would be able to do those things. So the investors in Tesla really are trying to get to validating the riskiest hypothesis. Your capital is scarce. So how do you front load verifying that? Tesla's riskiest assumption is, can we build the electric motor and battery to deliver on the power, range, and performance requirements? So this all sits in the feasibility risk. Will it work at the scale for the user performance that is needed to make this viable? So the first version of the Tesla Roadster is really validating the riskiest hypothesis. It's not trying to validate, can they make mass market volumes? But if you look at the evolution of the different cars, each one is validating a different risky assumption at that point of their life cycle. So their early investors wanted to know, does it work at all? But over time, as Elon Musk says, we need to build gigafactories, and they cost $5 billion each. That's kind of a high price point. How can we be certain that this volume will work at scale? How do we know if that's going to work? So each of these other cars was proving a different hypothesis at that moment of time, leading up to the point where they were confident enough to build the gigafactories. So the takeaway here is you really need to focus your scarce development cycles on validating your riskiest hypotheses. And it's worth thinking through, are you doing that? Or are you tackling the simple, obvious stuff early on, where in this day and age, with capital being hard to come by and a lot of companies having to make sure that they lower their burn rate, you better front load your riskiest hypotheses, because that's the best way to secure your next round. So once you've got this risky hypothesis and you're working through your disruptive idea, let's talk a little bit about how to prepare for disruption. So you've got a disruptive idea, but are there barriers for your target audience to benefit? So you may make the best seats in the house, but is there a brick wall right in front of your users that's going to prevent them from benefiting? And there's many examples across technology and lots of interesting studies about the productivity paradox for desktop computers, laptops, enterprise resource planning systems. So many of these tools and processes took decades for the clients to really get the proof points that they actually lifted productivity. So in order to answer this, we're going to go to the past. And I want to talk a little bit about the dynamo electric motor and the productivity paradox. So if you go back to the 19th century, factories at that point were arranged by power needs, and you put the most resource-intensive equipment closest to your steam engine, because that's what powered all these drive pipes and all of the belts that powered the entire rest of the factory. And so then the electric motor comes along, the dynamo, and they installed them in many factories, but there were no productivity gains. And it really was confusing. Where did they go? Well, it turns out that just swapping an electric motor for a steam motor doesn't change your benefits. It's only when you take advantage of the new technology, the flexibility of rearranging the entire factory flow around a worker in a small motor, only then do you unlock huge productivity gains in the power distribution. And it took 30 to 50 years for a lot of factories to do this. And the real takeaway from this was it was a power revolution with the electric motor. And by moving power down to the hands of individual workers, it significantly changed their roles. And it took time for the workers themselves to even accept greater responsibility, be trained and understand how to use the tools, and be able to have the individual creativity to suggest better ways to arrange a factory flow. So how does this work for us now? Why is this important? So at GfK, we have a new product. We're literally under 2 weeks away from launch, called GfK Neuron. And we are in the data business. And this is a really interesting product that goes above and beyond just descriptive analytics and starts building toward predictive and prescriptive analytics. How do we help customers and clients understand their competitive landscape, what consumers are doing, what is the brand sentiment, what is their sell-through rate, all sorts of interesting and rich information. And we have to ask ourselves some very important questions about the knowledge revolution. So the dynamo motor brought a power revolution and distributed power down to individuals and changed their jobs. So we are actively working through, are our clients ready for this type of innovation? And these are some of the questions you can ask yourself as well if you are in a business-to-business product that you're trying to scale up. Is your target user empowered to make all the decisions that your product allows? Will your clients need to adapt their roles or responsibilities in order to unlock the benefits of your product? And do they believe that this is their future? Because nobody's going to do any change if they don't believe it's critical for their future. And we see some really interesting things as we look at our clients around the world. Some marketing departments are very much leaning into how to leverage data, how to take advantage of it, and they already know they need to adapt their roles. We've got other clients with marketing departments that are much more traditional, and they distribute the decision-making authority across different functional areas. So it's forced us to make some important feature decisions about not just which persona to serve, but what persona at what maturity level of their data decision empowerment. So those are important things to think, not just of the product, but how are users going to use it in their environment. So as I'm starting to summarize here at the end, you got to validate your riskiest hypothesis and front load that, because your development cycles are precious and money is not unlimited. So you really got to front load that, because for your investors, that's going to give them the confidence that you're tackling the high uncertainty and being able to progress with a viable business. And you may have to prepare your clients for product adoption. What do they really need to do to take advantage of all the benefits? And the whole dynamo productivity paradox, it was very true in laptops and desktops as well, where, you know, people would joke the productivity, you can't see it anywhere. The IT companies are making a lot of money, but none of the clients were seeing any of the benefit, because it was only when you changed somebody's role to take advantage of a laptop's mobility that you really started to take advantage of what a laptop could do. So in closing, I've got a couple books to recommend. So I've had my leadership team in the last couple months read the two books on the left. First, we have Competing Against Luck by Clayton Christensen. He was a very well-respected professor at Harvard who just recently passed away in the last couple months. But this book, Competing Against Luck, is all about jobs to be done, a really important concept that goes beyond personas and really figures out, well, what is the real job that your client is hiring your product for? And what are your competing, what are you competing against, including buying nothing is one of your biggest competitors, non-action. So that's a really good book. Measure What Matters is another book that is from John Doerr, who is famous venture capitalist, been on the board of Amazon, board of Google, and Google is very heavy into outcomes and key results, which is really what this book's about. So these two books nicely complement. The last one's a podcast from the BBC, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. They're great little snippets, 10 minutes each, and they have one on the dynamo and the productivity paradox that inspired me to include it in this talk. So I'd recommend listening to that. The last point I have here is a summary of some of the product principles that over the years I've developed from Amazon, from Tesco, from startups that have really helped me and my teams make better decisions. So I'm not going to read through all of them, but by combining the IDEO Venn diagram of desirable, feasible, and viable with some solid product principles, you help teams make better decisions in place. And that means fewer escalations. And that means better accountability for teams. And that leads to more trust and more accountability, which allows everyone to go faster. So I found they've worked really well for me, but I encourage you to figure that out for yourself. Oh, and somehow I put down at the bottom, we are hiring. I didn't realize that was going to be on the screen. There must be a technical error. And at that note, that's all I've got. So Ada, I think we switch over to the Q&A at this point.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sean. And those are the product principles I was talking about right at the start. They definitely made me think about what I do on a day-to-day basis. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
I have got a survey that I would love to add to the comments box, but I can't seem to right now. If you can possibly spare 2 minutes to fill out this survey, which is tinyurl.com/pt29April, we would be really grateful for your feedback. Now, I'm looking through the comments box at the moment. I'm not seeing many questions. So if you can get posting so that we can direct the questions to Adriana, James, or Sean, that would be lovely.
All right. Well, the first question is, how many times did I say the words user, customer, or client? I wasn't keeping track, so.
I'm sure James was having a few sips of beer whilst we were talking about that. Whilst we wait for questions to come through, I've got one actually. So you guys have all worked in different markets, not just in the UK. I'm quite curious to understand what are startups like in different countries. Are they very different, or are they quite similar to London?
I think every region has their own culture and feel for what they feel is important, how they work. And a lot of it comes from what are the established companies that generate a lot of early talent, and then people end up leaving to go do startups, because that's where Silicon Valley became such a rich place to do startups, because you have so many other companies where people could come out of school, learn some skills and discipline, get some things wrong, get some things right, and then learn how to evolve and become better at their roles. And so, Seattle was fortunate with Amazon and Microsoft, Real Audio, and a number of other technology companies that would start those communities. So I think every area's got their own. One thing I will observe, having worked in the US for a long time and been in London for 6 years now, I find that there's a passion for the London product manager that is fantastic, but there's almost an overly orthodox respect for theory. I find that people are so clinging to theory at times that they lose their pragmatism. And I find it a little bit odd, and I think it holds people back, because, you'll have violent debates between people about what does a product owner do versus product manager, when every company uses those titles in so many different ways that you got to just recognize that sometimes there isn't only one way.
Sean, +1. I think that's sort of the inspiration for my talk today, is that stay away. I mean, read the books and all of that, but apply it given your context. Don't stick to it theoretically.
James, anything to add? I think you've also recruited and done lots of stuff in Europe.
Yeah, I have recruited a lot in Europe. From a people perspective, an interesting thing that I find in Europe is that in the regions that I've recruited, which is Holland and Germany and Switzerland, all of those countries are much more comfortable being direct about what they're looking for and what they expect than perhaps we are in the United Kingdom. And I don't know whether it's just a style of communication or whether it's something about how we think about legislation in this country. But it has always been refreshing to recruit in Europe, because there's never any blind spot. Whereas in the UK, I think what we really need to focus on, it's why I advocate competencies, we really need to focus on honest communication about what is it we're trying to achieve, what do you need to know in order to do that, and then how do you need to go about and do it.
Cool. No, thank you very much. We do have some questions coming through. One from Andre. What are the top 3 product tools that you use and love? There we go, on the screen.
You want to go first, Adriana?
Yeah, I think there's so many. So, well, Slack, everyone uses it, so it doesn't count towards the 3. I think, well, the critical one in order to work with your product team is either Jira. I've used Jira a lot in the past, but I'm now using Clubhouse, which I'm finding really, really good for my smaller team. So that's in order to organize the work. Then I think you need to have something for your scale to represent your roadmap. So I have used Trello. I have used, I think I used Roadmonk a couple of years ago and things like that. I have used Google Slides, just as long as you're conveying the communication, in the communication, what comes next. I think the tool, it's not that important. And then there's one that we're using a lot recently on the design front. I've used Envision. We're now using Zeppelin in order to collaborate on design. So I guess those are the 3 go-tos at the moment.
Yeah, I've used AHA a lot across the teams for roadmap management, and especially across Tesco. I implemented it there. We had 200 product managers using it. And I think there's value, especially in shared services where you're dependent on other teams and you need transparency without needing to set up a call to figure out, are you going to deliver that new feature I need next month or not? There's a lot of value in having that kind of visibility across different applications. So I've liked AHA, and I'm implementing that at GFK. But I'll also use your question more broadly of just a tool doesn't have to be an application. One of my favorite product management tools is the press release. write a future-facing press release and put it out 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and write it in simple customer-facing language of why will the world care about your thing? And I tell people that it's the cheapest innovation tool they will ever use, because if you get it wrong, you've only wasted 10 minutes of your time writing a one-page Word doc. But if you get it right, it could be worth $1 million. So write a press release before you build anything. Write more than one.
Just to add one, I think what I didn't mention, which there are many tools for, but all your analytics, right? I think that's, we consider Google Analytics, Amplitude, Mixpanel, and many of those. I think in the end, you just need to be able to read what your users are, how your users are using your product, and you cannot be operating in the blind.
Cool, thank you. Now, James, I appreciate this question may not apply to you directly. Have you got any tools that you use in your trade that may be relevant for the audience?
I don't think I've got anything to add to that would be any better than the expertise we've already heard. So, no.
Excellent. Let's go to the next question then. We've got Wayne. His question is for you, James. I'm not a great fan of psychometric tests. What is your take on them?
It's a great question, Wayne. I think psychometric tests can have some value, particularly in an enterprise where you normally have a large or an established talent or human resources function behind you. What psychometric tests should do is signpost us in how to get the best out of people and the sort of things we should be mindful of when we're communicating to them. Typically, to be able to bear that sort of stuff in mind, you need the support of a human resources team who, as I say, are either signposting you or have a framework for employee engagement and learning and development, which supplements what you learn in the psychometric test, but actually can then create some actionable, some actions or some insight that you can then act on. In a startup, I mean, I've never found them useful when you've got a very small team. I always advocate just having a really clear understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve, and then the knowledge, the skills, and the behaviors behind that will underpin your ability to achieve that. I think it's a gray area in a startup, but psychometric testing, again, it needs a function behind it to really deliver some value. And therefore, unless you're in a later stage scale up or an enterprise, you probably don't have the teams of people that you need in order to realize the best value. Adriana, Sean, have either of you had experience with psychometric tests, positive experience with psychometric tests, I should perhaps add?
Give me some examples of psychometric tests. Is this like Myers-Briggs or?
Myers-Briggs is a perfect example, Sean, yeah.
So I love them when I'm having an established leadership team and we all need to understand how to work with each other and where we're coming from. I've never used one for a candidate on an interview. That feels a bit heavy.
Yeah.
How about you, Adriana?
Well, I haven't used those for hiring purposes. One methodology that I really liked was I have to refresh my memory, but it's based on behaviors in the end and how, given specific examples of how they would act upon the things that we're hiring for. If you're all interested, I can share that because it's a book. I've forgotten the name, but it's really good. And we use that a lot at Pollen. So happy to share when I refresh my mind.
Yes, please, Adriana.
I think if I was going to make one suggestion, if you work in a startup, psychometric testing as a long-term plan may not work for you, but what I would recommend is every time you get together as an exec team or a management team, spend a little bit of time at the start of every meeting asking how you all feel. Just 1 minute going around the table, 3 words. How do you feel today? And that will give you a much better level of interaction in these small teams where things change so rapidly than trying to refer back to a psychologist's impression based on some random questions that you answered 6 months ago before you joined the company.
So I remember now the book is Lou Adler, The Essential Guide to Hiring and Getting Hired. I really like that methodology.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next question from Darwin. Is a question for Sean. Any advice for situations when stakeholders or investors are more interested in vanity metrics rather than validated learning?
Well, when somebody's holding the checkbook, you certainly have to listen. And it depends on how experienced of an investor are they, because if they're a really experienced, seasoned investor, they're going to want to see a compelling story for how driving the outcomes you think are most important will result in a successful and viable customer base and business. And vanity metrics is kind of a tricky one. You know, I spent Amazon early on really focuses on data and metrics. And so that was instilled in me very early in my career, and I'm fortunate for that. And before I would call something a vanity metric, Amazon would say there's input metrics and there's outcome metrics. And the inputs are things you can control directly, like how many people do we have working on a team? Or how much of an ad budget did we put in trying to get users to a new product? Or how much inventory or how many sellers are in a new market that Amazon's going to launch? You can influence and control all those, but they don't directly relate to outputs. However, if you don't have enough sellers, you're never going to get to your first £1 million of sales. So before you call something a vanity metric, first I would ask, is it an outcome you care about? And if it's not an outcome, is it a primary input to an outcome you care about? And then you can, as long as you understand this is an input metric and we need to drive, if we need to build an entirely new application and I've only got one person on the product, counting how many developers working on the product is an input, but it lets you know when you're below some critical threshold versus do we have sufficient teams applied to it or sufficient budget? I would only call something a vanity metric, I think, if we're tracking it as a more important metric than an outcome. And I think that's the important piece. So for an investor or stakeholder, if you can show that the vanity metric has no correlation to what you really care about or only poor correlation, then you might be able to justify why something else would be better. But you're never going to dissuade them of their vanity metric. You can only replace it with something that's more relevant. So I would suggest reading Measure What Matters, because it really goes into a lot of good details about that.
Mm. Cool, thank you. Adriana, James, anything to add?
I think, well, it's about asking. So I found interesting the contrast between vanity metric and validated learning. I think that the vanity metric, it's wrong, if you want to call it like that, if it's dictating how you're making product decisions. So that's a fundamental that you need to probably agree on. The vanity metric, you can be measuring it, you can be tracking it. If that person is interested in it, then great. If it becomes a reason, let's say, for example, downloads, that becomes your metric. But in reality, downloads doesn't mean much if there's no engagement with your app. So if you're making decisions just based on downloads, that's just one part of the puzzle, right? So I think dig deeper into how you're going to be making decisions and how you're going to be prioritizing things. And then, feel free to keep on measuring that, but don't make that as your driver for decision making.
Cool. No, thank you. I'm actually going to go and jump to the next question by Hansa. It sounds like it's a people-related question. What differences have you noticed in how product teams are structured between startups, scale-ups, and enterprise? James, I think this fits your area perfectly.
What differences have you noticed in how product teams are structured? So there's typically a lot more. The larger the company, the more the hierarchy. I think that's probably worth bearing in mind. You tend to have a lot more specialism the bigger the company. So I think, as I referred to on one of my slides, if you're working for a massive enterprise, then you're likely to have a huge product with big reach, but you might be responsible for a much smaller part of it. You often have access to far more resources. So if you're in a startup, you and whoever else is working on product probably has to share resources, like one designer, for example. Whereas when you get into bigger teams, you can typically work, you can outsource work, you can work with contractors, you can work with broader teams of people. Again, if you're working for an enterprise and you think about the size of a development function, you probably have a lot more people that you can rely on. Now, the flip side of that is you possibly have more stringent delivery targets. Budgets possibly matter a bit more, but you might also have access to project managers or business analysts. So again, those kind of skill sets that you probably don't see when you're in a small or an early stage startup. So I think the difference tends to come down to how many people there are, but also the levels of specialism they have. And that therefore reflects into how you think about who you want in a startup. Typically in a startup, you need people with that broad skill set. The bigger the company, the bigger the team, the more likely it is that you can focus on specialism. I hope, Hansa, that answers the question.
Cool. No, thank you.
And I think as I think of organization design, some of it is also what is the life cycle of the product itself. So there's times where we've got a vague concept and we don't even have a development team yet because we don't even know what we're building, that you may only have one relatively senior product manager working on. And usually you'd want her to have some strong strategy and other skills because we don't know what we're building yet, but the business model really is going to matter to resonate with it. And then as something goes through its life cycle, you may have a small team emerging, and maybe you have more than one development squad who's also going to work with on the same product. And now you've got to coordinate across more than one backlog. So I think as the number of sprint teams that have dependencies grow, that's one of the biggest factors that changes the way product is set up. It's a big deal to go from a fully self-contained team of, it could be one, maybe even two squads of up to 20 developers with some designers and product managers all working on the same thing, to suddenly you're in an enterprise environment and you need to call the payment service. In fact, you can't launch your product without the payment service adding some new functionality to support digital downloads. But is it in their backlog or not? So as soon as you get into a shared services environment, everything gets a lot more complicated. But everything also gets a lot more scalable because you can build a new application much faster because you don't need to build the identity service and the payment service and the data layer and all the other elements that come with it. So, it's one of those trade-offs that ultimately is worth it if you have a lot of propositions you're trying to make across a number of business areas.
Cool. Excellent. We are 8 minutes to 9. So I think we're going to have a couple more questions. I'm going to go back to Sergey. In a potentially risk-averse enterprise, it's a question for Sean. How would you suggest approaching stakeholders on testing your riskiest hypothesis?
Don't tell them. Well, maybe that doesn't work so well. But, in some cases, I think, one of the development principles I've had is, how do you release value in thin slices? And too often, people find their riskiest hypothesis out after 24 months of development with full squads. And if you got it wrong, well, that's a really expensive way to go about it. You got to make it cheap to be wrong. And so sometimes if there's a really risky hypothesis, if you could test it with, depends on if you think of feasible, viable, desirable, what is the nature of your uncertainty? If it's a demand uncertainty, I do talk to a bunch of customers and try and get as close as you can to real product signal, real demand signal. And if you do it on a small enough basis, I don't even tell anyone else. Just have the product and design team go and do the research. If it's about a feasibility assumption, well, that's when your stakeholders better face into. Tesla, will the motor work? You kind of have to face into that pretty early, because if the feasibility doesn't work, well, then the whole thing is wasted. The demand side is a little bit trickier because so many senior execs have strongly held beliefs that might not be based on fact or might not be based on anything because no one's done the research, and they just, maybe they disagree with your proposition idea. And that one is the one where you can do some research on the side. You can build some evidence that it is customer-led. And that becomes all the more powerful if you, instead of bringing back of this is what I want to do, and instead you bring back this is what customers have told us they want, and here's the evidence, it becomes hard to ignore.
Cool, good answer. Adriana, James? a couple more questions, so let's crack on with those.
Yeah.
Wayne, what is your preference? Is it remote or on-premise teams? And how do you see the landscape changing given the current coronavirus?
Remote or in-house? Is that the question? Oh, there you go.
Is remote or on-premise?
Like working remote, right?
Again, you know, you may have your preference, but you have to adjust to the new reality, right? I think, and don't resist the change. I think what we have learned from these times is, and I think that's a very positive move, is that the more you trust people and the more human you are with your team, the better you can work, right? And I think recently, our head of engineering, she was like, guys, I have a terrible headache and I need to step out for an hour, which if you're working in the office, that's probably not even possible, or you know, you may ignore it because you have to save face. And it was pretty safe. And I'm liking that we're creating the safe environment for her to feel like she can step out, because how are we going to use her brain if she has a headache, right? So I think, of course, in premise, there's a lot of conversations that happen when we go back to normal, or when we can meet again. I really hope I can have a beer with my team and celebrate our victories, and probably, you know, complain about other things. But at the same time, I think it's still possible to connect, even when it's remote.
I don't know if many people know that the cost of an office in London for like 100 people in an area like Old Street, you're talking £500,000 per year upwards. I mean, it is an extortionate amount of money. And I think there are a lot of companies now that will look at what they have been spending, and then they'll start to look at their output and whether they've been driving business outcome throughout this period. And they should probably ask themselves some fairly serious questions. If someone gives me £5 million to scale my product, should I be spending 10% on that, 10% of that on desks and chairs and, you know, a place for us all to live in? There are certain businesses, particularly if you have big commercial functions, big sales functions, there is a lot of benefit in having people in the same room. And I'm not saying that I don't agree with the cross-functional collaboration that you can get as a result of having people in the same room. Having said that, I've also worked in startups and scale-ups based in offices, WeWork offices and other kind of serviced office buildings, where people spend the whole day trying to get away from other people so they can actually focus and get some work done. So yes, I think the impact of COVID will be that lots of companies think about what they're spending. Ultimately, we're creatures of habit. So I think a lot of people will return to what they knew before, but hopefully there will be a slightly more progressive approach to things like flexible working and working from home when necessary, and being able to be remote when you have family commitments and all that sort of stuff, which I know is high on the agenda for lots of companies, but we should have now seen some proof points that actually it doesn't adversely impact the ability to be effective. Sean, I cut you off, sorry.
No, that was all right. I was going to say something similar. Now is not the time to buy a commercial office building. Let me just put that advice out there first. Every company is going to rethink what it means to work and ways of working, and how important is it to have people in the same physical space. You know, I've always had remote development teams and product managers and designers in different locations. The best performing teams have been the ones that have had the best relationships. And I get found you get the best relationships when people have time to spend time together at some point. Doesn't always have to be always, but teams that have a chance to meet in person build stronger relationships. And, you know, product management's a collaboration function. And I spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, if you think about a product manager, there's at least 4 groups you'd like them next to: consumers or users, stakeholders, their designers, the developers. And if they're not all in the same physical space, the same city, you're going to have to make trade-offs. And if I have to make a trade-off, I'll always put a product manager closest to their customers and their users. Because it doesn't matter if you have a great relationship with your engineering team. If you build the wrong product, it doesn't matter how well that product works. So I think working styles are going to have to change. People are going to be working from home more. Hot desking rates will go up because not everyone's there at the same time. So that's going to be a reality. Office spaces are going to go down. And companies are going to rethink, do we need this big shiny space?
And the pools of talent are going to open up as well. I think that's also
right.
a benefit that I see, that you no longer need to be stuck to hiring in London because that's where your office is. I think it opens up for a lot
That's
of
right. Welcome,
Yeah.
Cornwall product managers. Welcome to the club.
Yeah.
You can finally work with London startups. But at some point, I do think there's value of getting people together in person.
Of course.
It's just, there's something about going to a whiteboard and working through a problem that is not digitally easy. It's so much easier just in person with a whiteboard.
Much easier, definitely. I'm going to ask a quick question that Pravina posted. So she said, very engaging talks, thank you. Often due to our enterprise scale, we get stuck building complex scenarios rather than testing the riskiest hypothesis. How do you persuade stakeholders to adopt that risky hypothesis approach?
Well, so both of the ideas apply here. Protecting your scarce dev cycles for your riskiest hypothesis. But there's also a concept from a book called Crossing the Chasm. It's a really useful book. Jeffrey Moore came out probably 30 years ago about how to bring technology to scale across markets when not all customers are willing to embrace change. And there's an important concept in there called the bowling alley or 10-pin bowling, where you may have a large addressable market, but if you try and solve every possible edge case from the start, you'll only do half of what everyone needs and your product will fail because no one will switch. And so you need to focus on your lead pin. And in your case, like we literally went through this with JFK Neuron, where we're building data support, decision support, predictive models for just about every function in a company: marketing, sales, new product development, distribution, channel management, supply chain. And they were trying, when I arrived 10 months ago, we were trying to solve 6 different persona needs and all their algorithms and all the different data simultaneously. And I knew in a couple of weeks it was never going to launch when we expected it to. So I picked the lead pin for the first persona and what's their job to be done. And we're going to be brilliant at that. And then when we're brilliant at that, we'll work on the next persona and expand to the next need across brand or marketing, category management. So that was a very important concept that I got our executive team and board early in to agree to. And then you've got the permission to focus and say, hey, that's a really interesting feature idea, not the lead pin. It's not phase 1. And it gives you the permission to also focus your design and validation cycles on just those users who are really most important for your first most important category. So if a lot of your stakeholders are asking for edge cases, I think it's useful to say, is that the first persona user you're trying to solve for? If it is, maybe there's some merit to solving for it so that, I don't know, you don't rewrite their entire hard drive when they push escape on their keyboard. But if it's not your first persona, you now have the permission to say it's on the radar, but it's not the first persona. When we get to that persona's discovery, we'll work on it.
Cool, thank you. We're now past 9 o'clock, so I'm planning to just ask 2 more questions and then we can wrap up. One from PR Chapman. How do you know when is the right time to raise money in a startup if both founders are technical?
I think it's an interesting mix of concept, but I think that the right time to raise money is because you're going to need money to get to a certain point, right? So if it's only the 2 founders bootstrapping, that's a different scenario. Probably, if they're too technical, they might need to hire someone more on the business side, and probably that person is going to be willing to do equity as well. But there comes a point in which you're going to start needing the money to start hiring your team. And I think that your team, if it's as diverse as possible, can get you closer to success. So if you have 2 founders that are super technical, you're missing the customer knowledge, you're missing the commercial sense as well. It's it's also depending on how those two technical founders are capable of convincing someone to do it just for equity, right? And I think at some point, if you want to bring diversity and test different concepts and so on, there's just so much you can do without raising any money. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to go straight into VC, right? There's so many stages that happen before then. But there's just so far you can get if you don't have enough diversity in your team.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that Adriana's made about getting diversity into your team as soon as possible. Something else I'd suggest, if you're two technical people, like you need to get some mentors around you, some advisors, some people who have been, if you are first-time founders, which the question perhaps implies you are, and you're both technical, go out there into the community, meet people, ask people for their advice, learn as much as you can about when other people raised at the wrong time, because that I think is so important in helping you prepare what your message to the market would be. Raising is incredibly hard. It's hugely demanding. Rachel, who's the CEO of Coral Kids, who I was with at the end of last year, she did her fundraise, her Series A fundraise, Series A or seed, when she was something like 8.5 months pregnant, which is just a remarkable achievement. It's hugely demanding on your time. You don't want to be wasting time doing it when it's not the right time. So source as much information as you can. And as Adriana said, try to get a non-exec or someone who can advise you, who perhaps has a different background and experience to yours, and definitely has been through the journey again.
Cool, thank you. I've noticed that we've actually got quite a few people on YouTube now, so I'm going to ask the rest of the questions. This is from Sarone. Given a product manager, it should be focusing on strategy and product owner focusing on tactical stuff. What would your advice be to avoid handover syndrome?
So this is one near and dear to my heart. Given that the word should, one person should focus on this, another person should focus on that, I would stay away from. This could happen. I think that I don't want to be unfair to this question, right? I think that there are scenarios in which you have these two, but I think in the handover, I think that the more brains you have thinking about a problem, the better. And just, oh, we lost Ada, but hopefully she's still there. The more brains that can be thinking about how to solve a problem for a customer, the better. And therefore, the handover shouldn't be either confrontational or shouldn't be like, I clean my hands and off you go. Because a good product manager is always going to want to know if there's such a distinction in that company between a product manager doing strategy and a product owner doing execution. Any good strategist is also going to want to know how well it went in reality in order to inform another round of strategic thinking. So, I think this is one that sounds like those definitions as by the book, when in reality, I would try to find a better way to collaborate together rather than forcing a handover.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. I find the best way to solve the handover is to not have two people doing what could be one job.
Yeah.
Now, not everyone's got the ability to change the organizational design, but I kind of see similar things at times when I see teams where I've got an innovation product manager, and then I've got somebody else who is managing the day-to-day and bug fixes, and ultimately one of those two is always unhappy. I like to say innovation is the job of a product manager, no matter the life cycle of a product. And I worry when I see product managers who are really focused on the strategy, but maybe do not understand the technical function of the product, or are not close enough to see their roadmap delivered through user stories with the sprint team. How many steering wheels do you want for this roadmap? Now, that might not answer your question if, look, you can't change the organization design. I think it helps to have absolutely clear ways of working of who's responsible for what. Otherwise, somebody's going to be unhappy, and somebody still could be unhappy if the other person has one of the more intriguing pieces of the responsibility.
Cool. No, thank you. One last question then. So Aaron asks, for Sean, what are some of the good ways to test risky hypotheses in a B2B context with long lead times?
So there's a lot of different approaches, and it depends on what is the nature of your uncertainty. Is it demand uncertainty for desirable? It could be, is there value? Or it could be, is it usable? Which are two aspects of that. There's lots of ways you can do really simple, even paper prototypes, sitting down with personas, interviewing personas, people that represent your personas, and getting to what are their jobs to be done. And then just working through with them what would help them do it better. That depends on how early the life cycle it is. It's easier for consumer facing to do a lot of validation because you just put a product out there and see how many people buy it. There's a lot of consumer product companies who will launch a Kickstarter and remove their brand from it. Sony was testing a smartwatch, and they wanted to see if there was demand for the features. But every time they do focus groups about would you buy a Sony smartwatch, they couldn't separate, were you doing that because it's Sony or did you really want the smartwatch? And so they launched a different branded version and Kickstarter to see how many people would bid. And that's real money that customers are bidding. So, there's lots of ways you can start to validate. Business to business is a little bit harder because, a small number of clients might be 80% of your addressable market. Depends on how niche it is. And ultimately, you can interview a lot of people and they could say their willingness to buy it, but when there's no real money changing hands, at the end of the day, you still have this uncertainty of how serious is it. So I guess the closer you get to understanding their true job to be done and what are all their alternatives, and are you really 10 times better than any of their alternatives, you can start to feel you're on the right path.
Cool. No, thank you. I think this is now the end of this meetup. I just want to say a big thank you for all three speakers. I've always worked in enterprise, so for me, this is super interesting to hear about scale up and startups. So massive thank you for all of you. If you haven't already, you can see my screen where there is a URL for the survey. Would love your feedback so that we can make the next one even better. And lastly, just want to say thank you again to the speakers and also to ProductTank organizers and Mind the Product for sponsoring this event. Thank you, and see you at the next one.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.